welcome to Sense and Sensibility, the Inflation Guy podcast. I'm Mike Ashton. I am the Inflation Guy. I am your host, and I am feeling feisty today. Today on the podcast, a common theme when I look at conventional sell-side or for that matter, buy-side economic research is that it seems so many people have learned stuff without thinking, so that they're very sure of the truth of the matter because they remember learning it, even if they can't articulate why it's true. The recent discussion about Trump's mooted plan to give hundreds of thousands of federal workers their walking papers is just one such matter. I'll explain what I mean about that in a moment. I'll also talk about mass deportations as sort of a contrary example. But first, a word from our sponsors. This episode of Sense and Sensibility is sponsored by Simplify ETFs, a fast-growing manager of liquid alternative ETFs. Simplify is bringing Wall Street to Main Street by providing access to institutional strategies perfect for diversifying your equity and bond portfolios, previously only available to big institutions and the ultra-rich. Check out their website at simplify.us. That's simplify.us, and you can find their entire lineup of ETFs at simplify.us/ETFs. Now, there are some facts that you can be confident are actually facts, even if you can't articulate why. For example, I remember that the derivative of x squared is 2x. And even though I can't remember how to prove it, I am very confident that that mathematical fact is true. Math is kind of like that. You may forget exactly, you may forget the rule, you may forget how to do something, and you may forget why that you do these various things, but you can trust that there's a pretty unbroken chain from 1 + 1 = 2 all the way to the most complicated mathematics, because that's how you build mathematics. And so even if you remember the fact and you don't remember why, you can probably still rely on the fact. On the other hand, something like statistics and regressions, I find that there are lots and lots of people who are very comfortable using the regression function in Excel without having any concept of what it means to run a regression and what needs to be true in order for a regression, a linear regression, to be the right way to look at what it is you're at the relationship you're examining. Many sorts of relationships are not linear, or they may be linear over the observed region and not linear outside that. So extrapolating is a bad thing to do. And lots of people run regressions without having any idea of exactly what the rules are, what the requirements are that have to be true if a regression is in fact a reasonable explanation or a reasonable summary of what's going on. But you can remember how to do a regression and just not remember and just not do it right. Anyway, economics isn't like sort of either of those things because there have been so many competing theories. I mean, economics as a science, political economics, it only goes back to really the 1700s. And so it's a fairly young science, particularly if you compare it to mathematics, right? And there have been so many competing theories since, Adam Smith and Locke and Hobbes and all that stuff to today about various parts of the economy. How does the microeconomics work? How do the macroeconomics work? That there's no complete unified theory that explains it all. So people fall back on the facts that they, quote, know. So for example, one of my favorites is the notion that recessions are disinflationary. And we've talked about that on this podcast before. It's simply not true. And you can demonstrate that it isn't true once you look beyond the one price that's highly sensitive to growth, and that is energy. But looking beyond that, it's fairly easy to show that recessions are not automatically disinflationary. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. But at the very least, the most generous interpretation is that it's often not true. And so saying that recessions are disinflationary is just wrong. At best, they might be sometimes disinflationary. But it seems like it should be true, right? Because people generalize from the microeconomic fact, right? The microeconomic fact is that decreases in demand, if you shift the demand curve, it causes the equilibrium between supply and demand to occur at lower prices and lower quantities. And so it seems natural that that should also be true at the macro level. If we decrease aggregate demand, it should mean recessions and disinflation. Unfortunately, it doesn't really work that way, but that doesn't mean that people aren't very convinced that it works that way. And in general, most of what comes out of economists at investment banks acts like economists behave like everything is driven from the demand side and the supply side is exogenous, meaning that it's determined by outside factors we may not know, but we definitely can't control, and they're unrelated to demand. So take, for example, another, of course it's true statement that you hear a lot, which is that aging societies like Japan's are destined for deflation. And since Europe's economy, or Europe's societies are all aging, and the U.S. U.S. has got a relatively younger population, but it's definitely got the baby boom is moving into retirement, and so we have a top heavy demographic pyramid as well, and so the notion is that, well, if you look at Japan, that deflation is coming for all of us. The idea is that old people spend less, and so therefore you should get disinflation. Now, first of all, it may be true that old people spend less on themselves, but it certainly isn't true when you consider healthcare expenditures paid for largely by the government, Medicare, that sort of thing. Old folks don't necessarily cost society any less, even if less of it comes out of their own pocket. So we should get, if it's true though that old people spend less, then we should get lower prices and lower quantities. It should be disinflationary. You should have something which looks a lot like what we got in Japan. The fact that aging demographics also imply a decrease in output capacity because people aren't working, they retire, right? When workers leave the workforce, you now have lower output capacity. That's a supply shift. But people sort of seem to ignore that or think that that's not terribly important. The confidence that people have. So this is amazing to me because the consumption part of it when you retire is ambiguous, right? Because as I've just said, individual old folks might spend less, but society doesn't necessarily spend less on them. So the total amount paid for a citizen doesn't necessarily go down. It's a little bit ambiguous of which way that goes. But the supply effect that they're no longer producing is unambiguous. It clearly is a supply shift. And so all else being equal, you should sort of look at that and say, well, I mean, it seems like my best guess would be that an aging demographic should be inflationary, not disinflationary. But the faith that people have in that model and the demographics notion that an aging society should lead to disinflation is enhanced because there's a single data point, Japan, that looks like it fits the model. You have an old population, low inflation or deflation for a long period of time, except that Japan also had almost negligible money growth for decades, and that might have something to do with low inflation. But whether money matters or not, the point is that the demographics argument has a single data point in its favor, and few economists lean against this consumption-driven belief, even though there's a very important supply side to it. A notable exception to that being Charles Goodhart and Manoj Pradhan in their book, The Great Demographic Reversal, and I got a link in the show notes to that book. It's an excellent book, and it really, I don't agree with all the conclusions, but it really does make a very strong case that as the world moves from, as birth rates decline globally, basically, and the population ages, it's actually an inflationary shift, not a disinflationary shift. Anyway, all that is a long-winded introduction for what it is that I actually want to talk about. Because like everyone else, I want to talk about Trump. Actually, in the quarterly inflation outlook that I publish quarterly, that's why it's called the quarterly inflation outlook. I'm kind of clever like that. And I published it on the refunding cycle, so it's February, May, August, November. And I just published it, and I have a section on tariffs, what tariffs under Trump, what effect that might have, what mass deportations, the size of the budget deficit, what I think will actually happen under Trump and what that will mean for inflation. And some of those things I'll talk about on the pod over the next couple of weeks. But what I don't have in there, because it just occurred to me last night as I was laying down to go to bed, was the inflation effect of mass layoffs in the government sector. So the backstory is that Trump, and by the way, you can Google Trump federal layoffs and you can kind of get the story. But the backstory is that Trump, both directly through things he said and through Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, who he's tapped to head up a new advisory panel, cheekily named the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE. They're going to aggressively pursue, quote, mass layoffs of federal workers. Now, the federal government employs millions of workers, right? And so these folks are saying, look, we could easily lay off a couple 100,000 of them, 500,000 of them, eliminate entire departments, whatever. And of course, the question, which, by the way, I didn't even realize was a question, was, well, it might be that they're not allowed to be fired, which is just really a terrible result if it turns out that the guy who's in charge of the executive branch can't fire whoever he wants in the executive branch. That's a really bad result. But leaving that aside for a moment, the fact I think that the fact that so many bureaucrats are insisting so loudly that Trump cannot do this is proof of two things. One, it's proof that he probably can, or they wouldn't have to say so loudly that he can't, and they wouldn't be worried about it. And second, it's proof that he probably should. But anyway, my purpose here is not to address whether he can or whether he should. That's the combination of, well, I guess the should is partly economics, and I guess I do have an opinion on that. But whether he can is a question of law and constitutional law and legislation. I don't know. I don't have any expertise in that. But what I want to talk about is what the effect will be if he does. If Trump manages to lay off a whole bunch of government employees, the effect is not going to be what you are hearing. Because what you are hearing is, if the federal government lays off, say, 300,000 or 500,000 workers, then the effect will be a recession, because hundreds of thousands of people out of work suddenly, and deflation because those people, can't spend as much money. So as an aside, this will be a lengthy aside, but as an aside, if you need any more proof that economics follows the politics in this regard, consider that we're told that laying off, 500,000 federal workers will cause deflation, but eliminating 10 million illegal immigrants by deporting them will be massively inflationary, because that will remove a crucial labor supply, right? So the story is, well, you take all those illegal immigrants out and, they're the ones doing, the hard work that no one wants to do. And so that work will now have to be done by people who are getting paid more. And so that's massively inflationary. Totally ignoring the consumption side of the 10 million illegal immigrants. And so that's sort of a similar story, except that illegal immigrants are way more tilted towards consumption than production when they first come into the country, because they haven't got jobs. They walk in and they immediately need shelter, food, education, apparel. Some of that they pay for. Some of that's paid for by state and local governments or the federal government. Okay, but the consumption happens immediately when they enter the country. The production doesn't happen until they find a job. And the unemployment rate among illegal immigrants is quite high. Okay, so anyway, the point is that removing illegal immigrants who have an incredibly high unemployment rate, but who consume shelter, food, education, apparel, other survival needs, and so on, that's often paid for by other folks, has an immediate effect on demand and price pressure in those markets, such as in shelter. It's one of the reasons that rents have not gone down. But it also has a supply effect. But right now, that supply effect is fairly small. So removing 10 million immigrants who came here 25 years ago would have a fairly significant supply shock, right? Because those people, some of them are doctors, lawyers, and they're producing stuff. Removing people who have just entered the country, 5 days ago, has no supply effect at all because they're not working yet. So mass deportations of recent illegal immigrants are disinflationary, not inflationary. Okay, so let's go back to then layoffs of federal workers, all right, which we're told is disinflationary. All right, now here I'm going to agree, but not for the reason that has anything to do with consumption, not that has anything to do with recession. Layoffs of federal workers are a much better deal than deportations of illegal aliens. Because even though the federal workers are employed, and so applying the same rule that says deporting illegals should be inflationary, you should say that this should be also inflationary, right? And even more so because the unemployment rate among federal employees by definition is zero because they're employees, whereas the unemployment rate among illegals is quite a bit higher than zero. And so you should say that, wow, laying off federal employees, should be massively inflationary. But here's the difference. If you are an illegal alien and you're one of the illegal aliens who is employed, you're actually producing something, okay? But the productivity of the government worker is approximately zero. They, for the most part, produce nothing. Ergo, their output per hour is zero. This isn't to say that government spending doesn't lead to production. When government buys a tank or a plane, it certainly leads to production, but it's not the government producing it. The government is shuffling around the money and shuffling paper. And it's the guy who pushes the pen across the paper to authorize its purchase. He's not doing anything. There's no productivity there at all. So here's the thought experiment. Let's suppose you had 1 million people in government and all they do is just sign papers and authorize spending. And you lay off 1 million people who are just doing that. What happens? Well, on day one, the unemployment rate goes up, assuming that they all are looking for jobs, because you have to be looking for a job for the unemployment rate to go up. But even if only some of them look for jobs, the unemployment rate would go up. But if even 10% of them found an actual productive job, then the nation's output would go up, not down. So you lay off 1 million government workers who are doing essentially nothing productive, and 10% of them find a job working at Wendy's. Okay, then the nation's productivity and nation's total output goes up, not down, because you laid off 1 million workers. Okay, so what about their spending? So nation's output probably goes up when you lay off lots of government workers. Okay, that's a supply shock. And what about their spending? Okay, so their spending probably goes down. Some people are not piggy banks, though. If all that mattered was spending in economics, then COVID would have been awesome, right? Because we had plenty of spending and no production. And in fact, what we got was we got a lot of inflation. Now reverse that, less spending, okay, because they don't have as much money, they've been laid off, whatever, but more production because some of them are working. That's a positive supply shock, not a negative supply shock like in COVID. It's a positive supply shock, so exactly the opposite happens, okay? And then the exact opposite means that prices, all else being equal, should go down, okay, because productivity of the workforce is going up. And what about the other 90% who aren't getting productive jobs? Well, they get unemployment insurance, so they get paid for doing nothing, which is just like when they were employed by the government. They get paid a little less than they were being paid before to do nothing, and now they're getting paid less for doing nothing. But really, there's no big change. You're just paying a little bit less. But net, you have a big win. So in summary, laying off bureaucrats likely leads to, one, higher unemployment, no question, bad for those people, no question. That's why we have unemployment insurance. That's why we have various social safety nets, is to help people who are between jobs, okay? But to the extent that they find any job at all, and eventually the economy will absorb 1 million people into productive jobs, then you will get an increase in growth and lower inflation. Okay, higher unemployment, but an increase in growth and lower inflation. So this is one of those cases where you'd have a recession if you measure by the unemployment side of things, not on the growth side, but you'll have higher unemployment and you have lower inflation. So that kind of looks like the traditional model, except that it has this case, it has nothing to do with the spending part. It has to do with the fact that it's a positive supply shock. But that's only true, higher unemployment, increasing growth, lower inflation. That's only true if you lay off enough of them to matter. If you lay off 50,000 or 100,000 workers, it's a drop in the bucket. It won't really mean anything. But getting back to the top, you don't get to that conclusion by saying to yourself, well, Johnny at the Federal Bureau of Left-Handed Screw-Top Mason Jar Blowers Environmental Protection Agency, gosh, when Johnny is laid off, he spends less. And therefore, we're in a recession and blah, 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 blah. That's what you would say if you memorize the page in the economics text that says when people are laid off, we have a recession because they spend less. But if you ask yourself, because you're a curious person and you're a smart person, if you weren't a smart person, you weren't a curious person, you wouldn't be listening to this podcast. And so you are curious and you are smart. And you say to yourself, gosh, does it matter what those people were doing before they were laid off? What if they were doing nothing? Then you get to the right answer, right? That laying off people who are doing nothing is good. In lots and lots of ways, one of which is it might persuade them to go do something where they are doing something. to get a job at Wendy's or, a big accounting firm or whatever, but producing something. If that's wrong, then the best answer, and it is the best answer if you think laying off Johnny is bad for the economy because he'll spend less, then the best answer must be, no matter what Johnny is doing, that we should just hire as many government workers as we can, even if they do nothing, because it'll be great for the economy if they have money to spend. That's obviously dumb, and it's also the platform of one of the major parties, but I digress. So kids, don't memorize the page, learn why it works that way, and if you don't think it works the way that it says on the page, then you should question it because a lot of the books are just wrong. And like I said, feeling feisty today. And that's all for today's podcast. But before I conclude with the usual admonitions, I want to make a quick note that I just mentioned our quarterly inflation outlook, and I just put it out. Normally, it's available to investment clients of Enduring Investments for free, or subscribers for $80 an issue or $75 a quarter. But I'm trying a new pricing strategy, and it's now being offered on the inflationguy.blog website for $40 an issue or just $29 a quarter. See the link in the show notes. It's absolutely worth it. And you can get a jump on some of the other things that I'm going to talk about probably over the ensuing quarter. And some stuff I probably won't talk about at all. Some extra stuff. Anyway, that's all for today's podcast. Please like, subscribe, refer others. Go visit the inflationguy.blog. Contact me, inflationguy@enduringinvestments.com. I'm on X at inflation_guy. Visit Enduring Investments if you need help with diagnosing and treating inflation problems, or if you want to know what's really true, even if the page says something else. And most importantly, defend your money. And if inflation is coming for you, remember, you know a guy.